Ladies and gentlemen, how are you? Wei Koh from Revolution. I'm so pleased to be with you here today. We are about to launch one of the watches that I have been anticipating the most from a personal perspective. It is a watch that is a 25th anniversary celebration for one of the brands and one of the individuals in the watch industry that I respect the most. The brand is, of course, Chopard L.U.C, and that individual is called Frederic Schäufele. And the watch we're about to launch is our very first high complication. It is a flying tourbillon, but it is also a stop-second tourbillon that is Geneva Seal and also cost certified. To me, that is already pretty extraordinary, but we've managed to get this watch inside of a case that measures 36.5 mm in diameter and just a mere 8.2 mm in height. To me, this watch is pretty much a revelation. I feel it's one of the most significant tourbillons to ever be created, and I'd like to walk you through why I feel that way. So first, let's talk about the size of the watch. I think most of you guys will say, well, 36.5 mm is actually relatively small. Well, actually, if you think back in the history of the most iconic watches, such as the 1518 from Patek Philippe, which is 35 mm, or the 2499 from Patek Philippe, which is 37.5 mm, or even the Philippe Dufour Simplicity, which is 34 mm, at least the original version was, and then there were, of course, collectors that asked him to make the 37 version, but of course, he prefers the 34 mm. If you think about it that way, the era of classic iconic men's dress watches was always somewhere between 34 mm and 37 mm. So for us, 36.5 mm was the perfect size for a complicated watch. But of course, there's never been a tourbillon that's measured 36.5 mm in the modern age. And why is that? Well, because when the first tourbillon wristwatch appeared, which was back in 1984 when it was created by Audemars Piguet, we were already transitioning to a period where watches were starting to get larger. And pretty soon afterwards, when we did see tourbillons, invariably they became quite large wristwatches. So how is it that Chopard's managed to put this watch in an incredible 36.5 mm case, which is also 8.2 mm in height? Well, let's talk about that, right? So in order for me to explain this watch correctly, I need to go back now 25 years and talk to you about Chopard L.U.C's very first wristwatch, and that is the Chopard L.U.C 1860. So that watch contains a movement that was a revelation when it was first released in 1996. That is the caliber 1.96, and that movement was something that when people saw it, their jaws literally dropped. Why? Because as his very first overture, his very first symbol to the watch industry in terms of what he was going to create, called Frederic Schäufele, created a movement that was a revelation. First, it was a micro-rotor movement, and it was the first micro-rotor movement of significance since Patek Philippe's caliber 240, which first appeared in the Ellipse several decades before. Second, that movement was both Geneva Seal and cost certified. Geneva Seal because that was the highest standard guaranteeing finish at the time, and still is actually to a large extent, and he wanted to demonstrate that any movement that he would create in-house would have exceptional finish at a level of anyone else in the industry. And he was also insistent that the watch be cost certified, meaning that the watch was proven to have merit as a chronometer. To me, that was an amazing watch because as his very first watch, he wanted to demonstrate to the world that his watches would be symbols of authenticity and true watchmaking. But now let's talk about the design of the Chopard L.U.C 1860. To me also, that's a watch that is a design masterpiece. 36.5 mm in diameter, 7.2 mm in thickness, with a beautiful guilloche amand dial and stunning diamond-shaped indexes. This set the groundwork for the watch that we would create a full 25 years later. So why do I respect Chopard L.U.C so much? I think it's because that every time Frederic Schäufele decides to focus on a specific complication, he wants to elevate the performance of that complication. So for example, when he created his first minute repeater, the Chopard L.U.C Full Strike in 2016, he became the first person in the world to create a minute repeater with sapphire crystal gongs, which massively elevated the acoustic property of that complication. Similarly, in 2004, when he launched his very first tourbillon, he did so with two great innovations. The first one was he attached it to the Quattro system, which is a system for 7 days power reserve using two sets of stacked barrels. Now, why is that important? Well, it's because this system maintained torque and a massive amount of torque and optimum torque over a 7-day period, which was the power reserve of the watch. Now the thing about a tourbillon is because when you go from the third wheel to a fixed fourth wheel, the last part of that watch is much heavier than say a regular balance wheel. So that has a tendency to exaggerate or amplify any faults the watch may receive in terms of a diminishment of torque. So by having an amazing torque, he also helped to guarantee the performance of his tourbillon. But the other thing which I thought was amazing was that in 2004, he became the second brand ever to cost certify his tourbillons, right? The other brand that was doing this at the time was Patek Philippe. I think they still continue to do so. What's important about this is the following. In 1801, when Abraham Louis Breguet patented the tourbillon, his intention was to create a chronometric device. He wanted to create a device that averaged the errors caused by gravity on a watch's regulating organs when that watch was in a vertical position. Of course, everyone in the 1800s was wearing a pocket watch. So the question's always posed to me, is there a rationale for the existence of a tourbillon in a wristwatch? And to me, the best rationale for that is if you are able to prove that your watch works and functions as a chronometer, right? And there's, up till that point, it was only Patek Philippe and now Chopard L.U.C. that were willing to give people that proof. Other than that, it could just be a very beautiful device, but I'm not necessarily sure if it actually improves the chronometry of that watch. So anyway, that's just my personal opinion, but it was very meaningful to me. So let's move forward in terms of tourbillon achievement at Chopard L.U.C. And in 2019, Carl Friedrich Schäufele introduced a new tourbillon, but this time he introduced a flying tourbillon, a breathtaking watch called the Flying T. It was a wonderful launch because he launched it at Chateau Monastier-Le-Tour, which is the vineyard that he's owned and has transformed into a biodynamic vineyard. And so over some wonderful glasses of Mr. Schäufele's wine, we were introduced to this watch. And when I looked at it, I thought it was absolutely stunning. I love flying tourbillons, so as you guys know, a flying tourbillon is a watch where the entire cage, balance wheel, and everything is supported only by the back of the watch at the pinion of the cage. But then when I turned the watch over, something remarkable happened to me. I felt this sort of wave of nostalgia wash over me, kind of how I would imagine a character in a Marcel Proust novel does. I felt this amazing sense of nostalgia because when I looked at that movement, it looked incredibly familiar. And I realized that, first of all, the flying tourbillon was an automatic movement, and second of all, it was using the base of the caliber 1.96, the very first movement that Chopard L.U.C. had ever created back in 1996 and appeared in their first watch in 1997 as the base caliber of the Flying T. So my mind started to kind of, go into kind of creative overdrive at that point, and I started to dream of a watch that was similar to the very original 1860 watch that was created by Chopard in 1997, but now featuring the Flying T's incredible flying tourbillon. I went over to Carl Friedrich because there were many people gathered around him, congratulating him for his amazing achievements, and he turned to me and he saw a smile on my face and he said, "Wei, you seem excited about something." And I told him, "Can I just ask you, just hypothetically speaking, would it be possible to take the movement in the Flying T, which is a 40 mm watch, and put that in essentially what was the original 1860 watch that you created back in 1997? And he said, "Well, since the movement is essentially based on the caliber 1.96, and since the Flying T's movement is not significantly thicker than that of the 1.96, I think it might be possible." So, I left from that junket kind of in a reverie, dreaming about this watch, hallucinating about it for many days or many nights actually. And then suddenly I got an email from Mr. Schäufele, and he said, "You know what, we've had a conversation about it, it's possible, we're gonna make that watch, and we'd like to make it together with you," which I thought was an incredible honor, right? I guess the last thing I should also mention about the Flying T was it's one of the very few stop-second tourbillons in the world, which means that when you pull the crown out, the cage and the balance wheel stop, right? Which is very, very rare. And the reason why that's so meaningful to me is, again, because a tourbillon is meant to be a chronometric device. And if you pull out the crown to set the hands and the watch continues to advance, that you somehow undermine this whole idea of chronometry. And so again, like when Chopard L.U.C. does something, they do it with every single rationale considered and so much respect to horology, right? The other thing too is that if you look at the cage of the Flying T, what I find so beautiful is there's an arrow indicator on that. And that arrow indicator, which is integrated into the cage, is actually your seconds hand. So this is when COSC does its certification, it's using this to measure the accuracy of the watch. So you're going to ask me, yes, but of course, but there's no seconds track on the Chopard L.U.C. Flying T Special Revolution. And I would say, well, actually look closer, because what you see is this micro guilloche around the aperture of the tourbillon, and if you look at it, there's precisely 60 marks, which represent 60 seconds. So you can actually read the seconds perfectly, and you could even synchronize your watch to start specifically at whatever second that you wanted to. So that's the thing of I love about Chopard L.U.C. The level of quality, the level of detail is really extraordinary. We're super honored to do this with Chopard L.U.C. on the momentous occasion of their 25th anniversary. I haven't even picked up the watch the entire time, so looking at it, it's just dazzling, right? It's kind of funny because my friend Louis Westphalen, who was at Hodinkee at the time, and is now at Breitling, he wrote a wonderful article comparing the original Chopard L.U.C. 1860, which is this watch here, to have a kind of spiritual kinship with Philippe Dufour's simplicity, right? And I think that is to some degree true. They were both very similar in size, and they both had dials made by Medellin, which is the best dial maker in Switzerland, in my opinion. The dials for both watches, and also now the new tourbillon, are all massive gold, meaning they're solid gold dials which received guilloché à main. And if you don't know what guilloché à main is, it's, I guess in English they call it a rose engine. What actually happens is there's this beautiful large size pattern that is reduced using a tracing system onto a tiny dial, and it's done guided by a person manually, and that's what guilloché à main is. And that is very, very different from a stamp dial or even a micro engraved CNC dial or a laser engraved dial, which has become kind of the norm of the industry today. So what I love about this watch is there's so much quality that resonates through it as well. And when you look at the tourbillon version of this watch now, it's almost as if, I probably shouldn't say this because I'm sure he'll get really angry at me, but it's almost as if Philippe Dufour decided to do a tourbillon version of the Simplicity, that's kind of the watch that I think it would look like, and you know, forgive me. And I know that's not the case, and full respect to Mr. Dufour, and of course massive respect to Chopard, but it kind of feels that way to me. What else can I tell you? The size is amazing. So you may think, okay, 36.5 mm, that's pretty small in diameter. It's like, well, you know, that's what I love about it. It's the size of all those watches that everyone's collecting now from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. It's the size of somewhere in between a 1518 and a 2499. But of course, it's got a flying tourbillon, which a flying tourbillon wristwatch would have never existed in that period of between the 40s and the 50s. So I think it's got this wonderful kind of retro modern emotional quality to it. The last thing I would say is, you know, flip the watch over and you'll see the Geneva seal that's on there, but you'll also see amazing anglage on the watch. You'll see extraordinary finish in terms of the application of the Geneva waves. It is genuinely a breathtaking watch. So it's a watch, from my perspective, that is an aesthetic revolution in terms of being the only watch I can imagine during our era that's 36.5 mm in terms of diameter. I should mention 8.2 mm in terms of thickness, which means that the flying tourbillon versus the just time and date version is just 1 mm thicker, which I think it's a pretty incredible achievement. And when you wear it on your wrist, it feels so slim and so elegant. From a design perspective, I think it's stunning. From a technical perspective, considering it's automatic micro rotor, flying tourbillon, cost certified, stop seconds, right? Stop seconds and stopping the cage, of course. I think it's just an extraordinary watch. It's in white gold in terms of the case. The massive gold dial has been finished in a very sort of like beautiful salmon color, which is reflective of the original watch as well. And I have to say, when I look at it, I feel just deeply honored to be participating in this collaboration with Carl Friedrich Schäufele and with Chopard L.U.C. Guys, I hope you like the watch as much as I do. We've made 5 pieces of this, one of which has just been sold before the watches even arrived here, so I'm not sure how that happened. But anyway, we've got 4 watches left. The price of the watch, which I consider to be extremely reasonable, is 120,000 Swiss francs, 121,000 US dollars, and I think 166,000 Singapore dollars. You know, considering what's out there for that price, for something with this kind of authenticity, this kind of like extraordinary technical innovation, this kind of respect to the traditions of watchmaking, and something as beautiful as this watch, I think it's unbeatable at this price point. So there you go. Thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, I bid you adieu.